You've probably seen this bit of kit in the gym, but perhaps being used incorrectly or not to its full potential. So join me for this episode as I talk to Alex Kanellis of Landmine University, and we explore the benefits of landmine training and how it can help with athletic development, whether you're general population or high-level athlete. So for those who don't know what it is, or maybe have seen it but don't know what it's called or what it's all about, what is the landmine?
So a landmine is essentially just like an elbow joint for the barbell. So when you see the a barbell that's inserted into a sort of rotating joint, and then people grab the other end and do things with it. Oftentimes, like traditionally, you'd see rows or you'd see like a T-bar machine. As sort of another variation. But yeah, it's just the landmine in particular is that piece of equipment and that setup, which essentially could be achieved if you just stuck one end of the barbell into a shoe and shoved it in the corner of the room. So it's a real simple piece of equipment, but that is specifically what we're talking about when we talk about a landmine.
Yeah, I think it's a great bit of kit, and it kind of saves the corner of the wall in the gym that always used to get absolutely wrecked.
Yeah, and you're seeing it's more and more common. I mean, it seems like a lot of the gyms that I go into, you see one on the rack. It doesn't take a lot of space, and so it's turned into sort of this no-brainer add-on that a lot of people actually do have access to. And it's a really simple piece of equipment.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's turned into quite a standard bit of kit in gyms. The problem I see is that people don't really know how to use it outside of, as you said, bent over rows on it. Like people just seem to not figure out, or they've not been exposed to how to use it properly.
Sure, yeah, I mean, and I obviously am in, try to take it to extreme in terms of what's the best possible way to use it, in a performance, based program, but it's also great. It's kind of moves on a fixed path, so you see people doing sometimes maybe, like, some great single leg work or, like you said, rows or, squats, whatever it is, yeah, it's not as popular as it could be. My thing has always been I think it's really good for a couple of things that I try to focus on, but there's a lot of things you can do with it for sure.
Yeah. So what makes it different from other training modalities? Like what makes it unique, would you
Well, so
say?
for me, it's my love of the landmine came from really just my exploration into biomechanics. So what the landmine allows you to do is a couple things. Number one, the rotation of the bar on that end cap allows you to get your body into some really interesting positions and postures, some strong postures outside of just neutral spine posture, which is, in my opinion, sort of overvalued and overprescribed in athletic training, world. So essentially, when we go to play sports, we get into all these different postures and positions with our trunk, with our spine. And we do all these beautiful things and run these beautiful kind of rotational side bending patterns. And then when we go into the weight room, generally, traditionally, we abandon all of that and just every single actual lift, every resisted exercise is done with your shoulders and hips square. And we sort of chase that neutral spine as if it's like a really important quality for athletes. What the landmine I realized allowed me to do was to sort of flip that and to say I can get into some really strong postures where my trunk is rotating and side bending or coiling if you're familiar with that terminology and lift some legitimate weight. I mean, it was easy to load and it turned into sort of this whole system for me, which is that I wanted to add rotational patterns into explosive lifts, cleans, jerks, snatches, which I always loved. As a strength coach with a pretty traditional background, I've always, appreciated Olympic lifts, traditional lifts. What the landmine allowed me to do was sort of more manipulation with my positions and posture while still being able to lift a substantial amount of weight. The other cool thing about the landmine is that it sits in front of you. When the bar moves up, it also moves forward slightly. So we're able to do all of our training sort of on the ball of our foot with a more aggressive spine and shin angle, which is just
Yeah.
another, benefit.
It's one of those things. 'Cause, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with the go-to guys, but they're talking about everything kind of being with that forward intent. And by default, as you said, it goes up and forward. So everything is with that forward intent, whether you believe that's kind of the priority in training or not. But in terms of kind of the getting outside of that braced spine, I think it's
Yeah.
got a much better carryover to all sport and athletic performance and movement in general.
Yeah, I think, theoretically, yes, and it's one of those things I'm purist. I'm not the biggest, and also I love the stuff that the go-to guys do. I think that's some really um, awesome drills and a really unique take on stuff. And I think that like my hope is that moving forward, the best things about every system get popularized and sort of turned into more mainstream. I think that you can go down rabbit holes, and one of the things that's always sort of been my anchor is that I really do want to get some of these concepts into as many people's sort of thought process as possible, particularly coaches and performance coaches, because that's sort of where my passion is. And on one side of it, there's the sports specific side that says, look, these angles and these patterns are what we're doing in sport. And therefore, it must carry over more, right? I'm training on the ball of my foot. I have a forward intent the entire time, being rewarded by forward intent because the bar moves slightly forward. So, those things actually allow you to lift more weight, when you do this set of exercises. I'm also being rewarded for being mobile through the spine and being dynamic, with what I'm doing with my trunk. And those are all, in my opinion, really powerful arguments. And if you were training an athlete, then you could probably make the argument that there's just more straightforward carryover into their sports performance when they're training like this as opposed to this or and so on and so forth. I think that, essentially that's a spectrum. And I think that my biggest thing and my biggest issue from the beginning was that, sort of like I alluded to earlier, that what strength coaches do is they go and they look at the body and they make sure that they hit an adequate range of motion and adequate speeds with your hips, with your shoulders, and they make sure that they load with enough intensity to, elicit adaptations, like real adaptations, which is sort of a prerequisite if you're going to do strength training or performance training. You need to find a way to make it intense enough that it, will actually make a change. And what I see over and over is, again, this obsession with the hip and shoulder joint. And then I see these coaches treating the spine as if it's like just one bone. And every single time they give their athlete weight or load any exercise, it's done with a neutral spine. And they're looking at every other part of this machine and appreciating its complexity and sort of its dynamic nature. And then they're looking at your trunk and just saying, all right, if we're going to load, you got to be neutral. And over, you have to chase neutral. And we're always looking for neutral. And so you take a kid that plays a sport, and then for an hour every whatever, 2 or 3, 4 times a week, you basically teach them that the neutral spine is the ultimate posture. And I don't think it needs to be that way. I think it comes from sort of this heavy weightlifting influence in the world of performance where, a neutral spine is really great for lifting heavy weight. And it's something that, strength coaches who love weightlifting have come to appreciate and worship a neutral spine because you need it if you want to do big time traditional lifts. But my viewpoint is just that I think we can look at the spine as, another super dynamic part of this machine and maybe train it with a little bit more variety outside of neutral. So what you see with, my methods is getting your body into as much of a rotated position as possible. And then with appropriate loading, teach you to be really comfortable, confident, and strong in that position. And then how to get to the other side. There's the sport specific side of it, which I think has merit. I think those arguments make sense. But then on the other side of it, it's just like, all right, there's a lot of moving parts here. Maybe we should move them. Maybe we should train the middle of our body with the same type of intent that we do our hips and our shoulders. Because when we go out to play our sport, it doesn't just stay still. It moves a lot. The best athletes rotate the most. And so just constantly teaching our trunk to avoid those patterns or avoid that type of movement at all, I think can be counterproductive. I'm not anti-weightlifting in a way that maybe the yoga people would be. I'd probably fall, somewhere closer to the middle of that spectrum because I love lifting weights and I've seen the impact that it can have, on performance. But yeah, I love that argument. I do think that the stuff that I do is, if you're going to use the word sports specific, more sports specific than traditional lifts. But I also love traditional lifts, and I think if nothing else, what I'm offering is a pathway towards maybe thinking about movement a little bit differently, but also just a way to expand your library of explosive training. So whether you're spinal engine purist who wants to keep everything under that umbrella, or whether you're somebody who just appreciates explosive weightlifting and wants to do it in as wide a variety of ways as possible, I think a landmine is just an awesome tool.
Yeah, I agree. I think with the kind of the traditional lifting and things like that, it's a case of you got to know what you're doing and why you're doing it, what the intention is. Don't just go and do squats because you think that's what you're supposed to be doing. And as you said, I think if the spine wasn't supposed to move, I think I literally said this to David Weck the other week. I said if the spine wasn't supposed to move, it would be a long bone like your femur. But there's a
Bingo.
reason it's
Yeah.
got all these segments because it's
Right.
supposed to move. And I think when people go and kind of overemphasize or have the majority of their training in squat, bench, deadlift and everything bracing and stiff, you're kind of detraining your body. You're training it into dysfunction because, as I said, you're stiff and braced and awkward, and then you've suddenly not got the mobility, the flexibility, or any capacity to kind of absorb force or create force outside of that neutral spine.
Sure. And look, I love to play devil's advocate because I think that's where we make the most progress. You know, because I see both sides. If I was gonna if I had an athlete who needed to build, absolute strength in their hips and needed, and our goal was to strengthen your ability to produce force through hip extension. I can load weight on your back that and with the neutral spine is the only way that you can support it. And I can take your hip through a range of motion with an intensity that will undoubtedly increase your ability to produce force through hip extension, right? And, sort of check that box. And is there a downside? Sure. And I am teaching you to brace. And I don't know that that's like, as long as you're playing your sport and moving dynamically, right? Like that's the argument of the non sport specific crowd is that, look, you can't get this type of intensity while you're playing your sport. That's why you have to play your sport. And this is different. Now, my argument and one of the reasons why I think that this system is important is that there are other postures where you can lift a lot of weight, and there are ways to lift weight dynamically. And there are probably a couple of ways to bridge that gap that make a little bit of sense, on a well rounded program. And I think that, deep down, a lot of strength coaches can relate to this. If you just focus on lifting and take it to the other side of the spectrum, because I think that's what's worth looking at, right? Is that on one end of the spectrum, you can look at an elite level power lifter who, because of the needs of his sport or whatever, has just trained neutral. That, their ability to run, throw, kick will and this is a specification thing and it exists across all sports and activities, but those things will deteriorate on a level that I think is alarming. I mean, if you look at a super high level power lifter bodybuilder who doesn't participate in any outside sport, their body will hold on to neutral with such power that they can't throw a ball anymore. That crawling becomes difficult, that just their gait pattern is completely affected. And it's obvious. And it's something that we've all seen. And a lot of those guys are walking around the college football weight room, waddling around the college football weight, right? That those people exist. And it's not necessarily that they're prescribing that type of training. But when you dive into that and you can see that extreme where you haven't moved your spine and you've loaded at the same time with a ton of intensity, it almost speeds up this, athletic drop off that's going to come with age for all of us, regardless. It can speed it up at like an alarming rate. And it's just so obvious. And I think that, like, unfortunately, because there is such a heavy weightlifting influence on the world of like performance and strength and conditioning, those are people that we need to reach. Those people, I mean, people that have that real love of strength sports and powerlifting, weightlifting, whatever it is. My mission has always kind of been to put something together that can expose them to some different positions and patterns where they can say, okay, I need to keep doing this. Like, I just haven't thrown that type of, multiplanar movement through my trunk since I started lifting heavy. And, I think essentially you could argue that this would extend their powerlifting career as well because they're moving towards this sort of state of dysfunction and so yeah, I'm rambling, right now, but I always try to see devil's advocate point of view. I think I still prescribe, heavy loaded neutral spine lifting. I just know why I'm doing it, and it's something that if I'm gonna do that, even intercession, like if I'm gonna do a heavy back squat, there's other boxes that become, really important for me to check, either before or after. So I'm sure that you'll talk to people on this journey that are very anti weightlifting, and they'll make really good arguments as well, because essentially we are patterning things into our body, and like I understand what they're saying. I understand what Goda's saying about, reverse gear and teaching your body to, and essentially teaching your nervous system to behave in a certain way. I, on the other side, have just enough anecdotal experience to say that there are athletes or kids that I've worked with who, loading them up on some traditional weightlifting movements is, that's what they need, or a part of what they need. It can speed up their, development, their performance. It could lower their center of gravity. It could, you can make a lot of arguments on the other end. So, um, I just love it all, and I try to continue like learning and looking at it from both sides, and try to put something together that makes sense to everybody. But I would agree, and that's, another one of my issues is has always just been sort of the way that the performance is looked at in terms of how much time we're spending doing certain things. And essentially that's ultimately going to be the issue, is if you've got the football strength coach who takes his guys from, right after the season, goes into a strength phase and doesn't realize that that strength phase is also neutral posture phase. And they spend the entire winter just, chasing neutral and living in neutral and, only training intensely in neutral. And then they get into the spring, which is, speed phase, and they start doing a lot of speed training, and they don't realize that there's nothing neutral about that. And that, running is rotational. And as soon as you change directions, it becomes even more rotation, so they start shifting their focus into training, more athletically or getting more sport specific. And they don't even really appreciate the fact that they're also training totally different postures, positions, right? It'd be
Yeah.
as if after the season, instead of doing squats or any lower body training, they spent the next 3 months just doing standing static holds with the barbell. Like there are other moving parts that are being neglected and that, being trained as dynamically as they could. And, on one end, you say, well, we're going to get better at our sport by practicing our sport. I can appreciate that. But on the other end, it's like you haven't moved your trunk at all and you need to play any sport. So let's please try to do a little bit of that with our strength training. I digress. I'm rambling, but that's
No, no, it's all good stuff, and I totally agree. I think the thing people need to kind of understand is that it's all about that client in front of you. People are very. It's all very well say you be at this end of the spectrum or that end, but I think top level athletes possibly do or should understand that there are going to be some sacrifices. Even top level gymnasts or top level dancers or martial artists, if you're performing at that top level, there are going to be some sacrifices somewhere down the line. Same thing with the powerlifters. If you understand that, if you decide powerlifting's your thing, that's what you're going for. Again, you should understand there are going to be some sacrifices in terms of mobility and movement and kind of running, throwing, catching, things like that. And I think also it's just a case of accepting that. But, there's also the argument of, isolate then integrate. So you can do your heavy work and then integrate it into the functional patterns. But part of me kind of thinks, why would you spend too much time training that dysfunctional move to then try and spend more time integrating it if you can just grab something like the landmine or a kettlebell or a club or a rope and, you're training that pattern from the start rather than trying to then integrate strength you've gained elsewhere.
yeah, and ultimately that's like the balance that I think is it's a balance that's worth, exploring. And it feels borderline like politics sometimes because um I think they get, people get married to, one lens. And I think, ultimately, yeah, I like to dig a little deeper and just ask why. So why are we doing this? If it's not the best pattern, then why are we doing it? And usually the argument is because we can do it at intensities that you can't do, with those more functional patterns. You can't get a true 1 rep max with a rope. You can't do a cable 360 step press and, elicit the same amount of growth hormone as you can with heavy bench, right? Like the arguments are there. The integration then becomes, yeah, more of a challenge, I think. And it's like, yeah, ultimately, I'm in love with a lot of different types of training. The landmine for me is really special because it checks a few boxes that I always felt like were difficult to check. In my background, I train mostly youth athletes. I train right now a lot of wrestlers and a lot of football players, and high school down through 9, 10 years old. And you see right away the sacrifices that are there. Wrestling is such a beautiful sport for me because and it's very similar to gymnastics, where you kind of ask yourself, do they need a strength coach? Because, anyone that was in high school knows that when you go and look at the high level wrestlers, they're super jacked. And these gymnastics guys are like super jacked and athletic. There's no arguing that. So what as a strength coach can you offer? Well, there's sort of this serenity that comes with working with wrestlers where it's like, hey, I'm not going to turn them into terrible athletes. They're already good athletes. They can already move. They already are strong and fit. So, what's something that I could give them, right? That will help. But I've worked with all different types of athletes and also all different types of people. And I think that the landmine is really sort of allowed me to scratch both of those itches and those people as well, where you can start to appreciate the dynamic nature of the trunk, what a strong coiled position feels like, putting big effort into something that's explosive that will also ultimately move you forward if you take the weights away and repeat the pattern. And then above that, for me, the explosive strength piece was big because I've always loved Olympic lifts, but the bigger my groups got and the more I worked with like large groups of athletes, the more I saw that, there was a certain barrier of entry and there were certain things that got in the way. Maybe it's, your ability to get into a front rack or just like, what your experiences has been so far coming in. You've never done any of it. I mean, when I was in college, I had never done Olympic weightlifting. I played football here at the University of Iowa. I'm in the weight room, with a super high level program. And I just realized that we're doing heavy cleans and I'm doing something that looks totally different than the guy on the other end of the room. I mean, and say what you will, but this is like a super high level strength and conditioning program. I was, had been taught the way that they told us to be taught. I just never felt comfortable with my front rack. I hadn't grown up doing it. And there were guys that were doing a totally different exercise than me. And so that kind of was a light bulb to me that, and I'm a better player than them. So that to me is also telling me that like some of the prerequisites that are, go into training like this are not the same prerequisites as, go onto the football field. That maybe me getting big and strong and moving people around at some point, maybe I sacrifice some wrist mobility that I don't need when I'm playing football. And now I just don't have it. And then they're trying to throw 4 plates on the bar and have me, jump into that position. Again, I love and appreciate the Olympic lifts, but this also allowed me to train at that speed, that rhythm, that flexion extension that I love about the Olympic lifts. It allowed me to do it in a way that has a much lower barrier of entry, for sure. So if I'm training a big group or a group that I don't want to spend all day teaching hang cleans to, here's a way for me to do it and get to loading faster because they can learn it faster and the pattern is super natural and the positions are as well.
I think that's it. It's a more natural position, is it? I mean, I think the other thing is our completely unnatural lifestyles where we're sat down more than we are. Most people just can't get into the positions you need
Right.
for regular Olympic lifting, whether it's the wrists or the shoulders or the hips or the ankles.
Then you're playing this game where it's like, okay, the same guys that are telling me I need to do this bilateral lifting because it's the only way to load intensely enough to actually create that stimulus. That now I'm spending the next year teaching with an unloaded bar. So like I can't make that make sense.
Well, that's it. What's the trade-off if you've
And you've
got?
got the movements and you've put in the requisite teaching, but that is a sport in and of itself. So, if you have that background, great, then you're getting that stimulus. But if we're talking stimulus, I want something that where I can get to loading, relatively quickly and just then, adjust the speed by the load, which was always the idea with the Olympic lifts. So yeah, that's where for me it starts to make, even more sense to include some of this stuff because you can teach it pretty quickly. And a lot of the stuff for my stuff that you'll see comes down to some of the same rhythms and sort of coaching cues as the Olympic lifts, where we are trying to get these big pulls. For us, it's coiled, but we're trying to extend this coiled pull. And then we are trying to lower our level, pull ourselves under the bar. We do it with forward intent and a rotational pattern. But ultimately, if you have a background in the Olympic lifts, you can pick up this stuff, at least the rhythm and timing of it right away. And then you're just now focusing on becoming faster with a rotational pattern and stronger in coiled positions. So yeah, I'll
Yeah.
digress. But
Yeah,
that's
I think with Olympic lifts, it's exactly that. Is like, is it worth the trade-off of, because it's such a high skill movement, is it worth the trade-off of spending 3, 4, 6 months learning the movement pattern before you can start loading it? Or
and
is it better
coaches
just
who
to pick
love
up
it and
something that you can pick
coaches
up
who love
quicker?
it and really understand it, I think that it can be worth it. I also think that it bleeds into, like, their assistants work too, like, that those same coaches are doing clean pulls and like the movements that they're using to fill out the rest of their program are all probably, and that was also an issue to me, like to get really good at this. It's, you're also going to have to do front squats, which I love. Front squats, you're going to have to get really good at your pulls. You're going to have to, like, it becomes for sure. If and this is just anecdotal, but if you're one of these coaches who loves the Olympic lifts, when your athletes step into the weight room, they become Olympic weightlifters, right? That becomes the goal because it's too daunting and difficult, and there's too much progress to be made just by improving technique. People do this their entire life and still refine their technique until they finally make it to the Olympics as a 29-year-old, right? So, like, you can't just do it and not coach technique because you can get more out of it with all of this technique and skill work. The coaches that love it and are passionate about it, I think their program ends up being pointed towards that goal. And that's not to say that it's a bad strength training program, but I love explosive weightlifting. For me, that's a box that I want to check at most sessions with my athletes. Like, I like the rhythm and the speed of it, but ultimately, I want to devote the rest of my time to other things. And so a lot of the things that I like to devote my time to are exploring different postures, positions, ranges. And my assistance work just isn't going to fall in line with constantly chasing bigger Olympic lifts. So, and of course, I'm super biased and just love the landmine version. So that's what we're sticking to for the foreseeable future.
And that's fair. I think it's a great bit of kit because it's a fantastic combination where you can load it up and go heavy still, so you've still got that explosive power, but with that coordinated, integrated, rotational movement. And as humans, again, going down the functional patterns kind of route, where our primary movement pattern is walking, and that's the rotational movement. And when you're playing sport, you're upgrading that to running and sprinting, and again, all rotational, throwing, kicking. Everything is rotational. So why would the majority of the training not be rotational?
Yeah, and I think that, the word functional, I think it's thrown around a lot, and,
Yeah.
ultimately, I don't know that that's a bad thing. I think ultimately, if you're gonna say that something is functional or we're gonna use it, I'd say more of like a spectrum, like, okay, this is more functional than that, or how functional is this? Ultimately, it should relate to the primary function of the machine, primary. And I like to use the analogy of a car where, like, I could get a new paint job or tint my windows, get a new stereo, and those might improve my car, but the primary function of my car is to drive forward. So a more functional use of my money would be new tires or a new engine, right? Like, and so I say that because, like you alluded to, if we're working with general population, usually the primary function that we land on is forward locomotion. And I think that that makes a lot of sense, right? That, like, we should be able to relate everything to gait. And if you're going to do something that's more functional, that means it should relate more to your gait pattern. And that makes a lot of sense. And then, legitimately, when we are working with athletes in the performance world, if you're going to use that term, then it's going to change. The primary function of a shot put thrower is to throw the shot put. And so, the tough thing there is that then you're stepping into this sports specific conversation again, right? The primary function of my wrestlers right now is to wrestle, I guess, would be the argument. Now, that comes with a bunch of different, patterns and movements. And for some sports, there's less. But ultimately, the primary function of the machine is the sport that you're chasing, or usually forward locomotion, unless you're so regressed that you can't do that, right? You could, and then it's what, crawling or whatever, but or sitting up. But yeah, I think, like, that's where that conversation usually goes, and I think that has merit. And then I think outside of that, you do have to look at, if you're talking athletes or sport performance, you have to look at the needs of their sport. The primary function of a boxer is to throw punches and move his head. I mean, there's always going to be a hierarchy, but I think that locomotion makes the most sense for most people. And ultimately, because it is rotational and because of the nature of that's why our body is organized the way that it is, so we can carry our brain around. I think that does make sense. And then when you talk about athletes who are outside of that maybe their primary function, like we discussed, the power lifter who's made it his primary function to bench, squat, and deadlift, you could say to that person, that's great, but after that's done and throughout, what's really going to be necessary for you is to walk around, to walk up to the bench, to walk up to the rack, to walk back to your car. And what you're doing right now does not relate to gait. Whereas with a lot of athletes, it really does, because like you say, we're running, we're sprinting, we're tackling, and we're doing things where the gait pattern is just ingrained, explicitly a lot of times. But even if it's not, if you're the guy that wants to throw the shot put or lift the heavy weight or whatnot, the argument that you could make is that you can extend your career a little bit by at least appreciating a little bit lower on your priority list locomotion and your ability to do it efficiently. And so, yeah, ultimately when I started down this path, I was probably stepping a little bit deeper into the everything needs to be functional world, I'm always back and forth. I like to think of myself as kind of in the middle, but that's where this came from for me, was that I needed weightlifting that related to gait directly. So take the pattern of gait, exaggerate the range of motion. So, if I'm going to run a small figure eight with my shoulder, let's make it a big one. Let's load it the same way that you would any other lift. If I go through hip extension and flexion when I walk, then you can make the argument that a split squat is going to help me walk, but I take it to bigger ranges of motion and I load it. I was trying to do the same thing with my trunk and locomotive pattern. And so that was the concept in designing it. And that holds true to this day. My favorite thing about it is that I think it can be introduced in a really straightforward and simple way. But all those things are the reason behind all of this. So I do truly appreciate those conversations.
Yeah. I think it's also not that it's not technical, but because it's on that kind of fixed path almost, it's a little bit less technical than maybe doing the same kind of thing with a kettlebell.
Yeah.
And I think,
Well, and I think so I think anytime we add more of a, dynamic movement to a weightlifting exercise, and this is true of all weightlifting exercises, they become a little bit more complex. They become a little bit more difficult. Now, there's this balance between a fixed path and a free weight, where a weightlifter or a power lifter uses a barbell as opposed to dumbbells, because it's a little bit closer to a fixed path. There's going to be a little bit less of a stability strain, and therefore they can load more weight. Now, landmine as opposed to a kettlebell, you can make the same argument, maybe even stronger, because again, we are on that fixed path and that one end is fixed to the rack. And that allows us to do a heavier rotational clean than we could do with a kettlebell or a dumbbell. And then on top of that, like we talked about before, there's the fact that the weight is in front of you and that it moves forward slightly throughout the exercise. And so you're going to be also rewarded for training with a little bit of a forward angle with your shins, with your spine, that also aren't there for a kettlebell or a dumbbell, where it is, essentially strictly vertical forces. So yeah, those two things combined, what they do is they allow you to lift adequate weights with some extremely violent rotational patterns. I mean, we can really let loose the focus. I mean, it's just where you're rewarded for rotating harder, faster, making it more violent, where I think sometimes when we use the free weights and we're trying to ingrain these patterns, it's almost more the stability and it can slow you down, and you're not necessarily going to be rewarded for pushing forward more, because you are lifting the weight vertical. I mean, ultimately, that's why the FP guy's got to pull his cable horizontally, because he wants you moving that way. Now, at the end of the day, we are just dealing with gravity. So that's the other devil's advocate, is that you talk about horizontal force, but when you sprint, it's, still mostly vertical or whatever. I mean, you can go back and forth with all that nonsense. But the nice thing with the landmine is that you can put your intent into driving forward for the entire exercise. and you can add some really violent patterns because you're catching in a tripod. It's you and your two legs of the tripod, but that third one, you'll actually be rewarded for putting some weight into it. So it allows us to train with these, violent, aggressive angles.
Yeah, I think it's unstable enough to have decent amount of movement variation, but stable enough to load it up. And you're not fixed on. As I said, you in terms of talking about rotation, it's not just a case of grabbing a cable and doing some cable rotations. It's translating that into actual movements that we actually
Yeah,
do.
well, just I mean, something that you can't that I like just qualitative feedback at some point, or sorry, quantitative feedback. I think it's like when I was getting into the whole functional training world, there was a lot of, like, really cool things that I was learning and positions and patterns that I hadn't been exposed to, and I think that, like, there's a ton of value in that. But at a certain point, it became about learning new tricks as opposed to, like, setting records. And for me, my passion in the weight room was always that. That was like that gave me, confidence, and it changed my life, just the ability to set personal records. That's why I fell in love with the weight room. So, like that, I needed to be part of this, and it really does lend itself to that like you can see it. We do the Landmine Games competition every year. You can see these people come and everybody sets a personal record. And that to me just shows me that with progressive overload, it works. It works with rotational patterns, it works with coiled positions. So to have a way to, really just like just to get that side of training for the people that want to stay true to, a truly functional approach is powerful. Also, people who are interested in their body's ability to rotate and coil. It's like, well, hey, let's put a number behind how much force you could produce when you run that pattern. And that's ultimately what this is about for me.
Yeah, I think it helps to have that kind of objective view as well. Like I said, I'm all for movement skills. I mean, I teach animal
Me
flow
too.
and
Yeah, me too.
Ido Portal stuff. That movement stuff's great, but it's very subjective. And it's building movement quality and skill, but it is subjective. Other than kind of filming it and saying, "Oh, well, that looks a bit better than that did," to actually be able to put that number on it, right? I've just snatched 10 kilos more than I did 3 months ago. That really helps, I think, people with motivation and kind of setting targets, and that not so much linear progression, but
Some
that
for some
progression.
people for some people, it's maybe not as appealing, and it is about learning new skills. And then, again, devil's advocate, and this is where my brain lives all the time is sports performance. If I'm working with, my wrestlers and every night they're coming to practice and learning and practicing new wrestling skills, and that part of their brain, that skill development part of their brain is stimulated. The devil's advocate question is if I bring them in and teach them 4 new moves with the rope, a steel mace, and a Bulgarian bag. Is that better than just bringing them in and working wrestling skills for, that session? Because you're not creating enough neural output to, say, make them stronger or faster, or I mean, if maybe you're cleaning up their mechanics, or maybe you're getting them into, there's, I'm sure, arguments on the other side of it as well. But, at some point, the extra stuff outside of sport, there does need to be a certain amount of output intensity. And for me, I just love that we can do that while running some patterns outside of just neutral. And again, I love all that other stuff, but when you're working with athletes, which again is just my passion, and I don't mean to keep bringing the conversation there, but there's just a certain amount of like skill acquisition. The same, and you can say the same thing about strength. There's a certain amount of strength where it's like, okay, you're a high school wrestler, you bench 300 pounds. I don't know if getting to 350 is going to help you win more wrestling matches, but you're very strong and that's going to help. So, at that point, it's like, let's shift our focus a little bit more towards skill acquisition. Well, you could say the same thing on the other side, that like you've got all this skill acquisition, it's time for you to put a little bit of emphasis into just output and your ability to do these things with more force. And so, yeah, man, that's just like, that's the fun balance for coaches to constantly play with. The stuff that I put out, I think, is, really a way for people to check a lot of different boxes. There's a skill acquisition side of it at the front, and there's constant technique improvements that can be made. But it is also going to definitely allow you to create that output and lift some heavy weights and see the numbers go up. and feel the bars start to feel lighter, and that's fun too. So that's not something to scoff at either.
Yeah, I think the word you said there was balance, and that's what it's all got to be about. As you said, that skill stuff, it might not kind of increase work rate, but the more you can learn to coordinate your body and control things and
For sure,
balance
and it can
stability,
open
that
things
is going to
up.
carry over.
Yeah, it can open things up, and I definitely love, skill acquisition as if there's a reason for it, and if you understand, why you're doing it, and it's gonna lead to, good training, right? I mean, if the Bulgarian bag is a great conditioning tool, you still have to learn how to use it, or else it's not, and you could say the same thing with a mace or, with a rope, and so, yeah,
Yeah,
I love it all. I
I
think
think
there's
there's benefit to everything. Like I
yeah,
said, it's just knowing the balance, where to put it, and based on where you're heading, where you want to go. Some people, depending on their goals, might want to spend kind of 80% of their time doing the skill stuff because they're not bothered about getting stronger necessarily or hitting numbers. And then again, for the athletes, they might need to build strength, but with that coordination. So yeah, I think the key is all balance and kind of smart programming and then monitoring it, seeing what results you're getting, saying, okay, that worked. Let's try putting a bit more of that in and see where
yeah,
that takes
and I
us.
also am big on just, like, get it while it's hot. If there's some area that, outside of just trying to develop an optimal program and check all your boxes, if there's something that's going really well and you're getting some really good feedback, you should keep doing it and pushing it. If you have someone who's, picking up the rope and is, really enjoying it and is improving and is getting, faster and expanding their skill set, I think you should lean into that. Just, and this is like with anything, just know that there will be a plateau. The same way there is with any other skill or movement. If you've got someone that's in the weight room and they're getting a lot stronger, and they're loving it, then for God's sake, don't abandon it, right? Allow them to do that. Just know that at some point it will slow down as their training age goes up and they are, overexposed to it at some point. And at that point, it becomes about minimum effective dose, using it to get that output, using it to keep those things fresh, but maybe shifting your focus to the next thing that they're going to be able to, really feel good about.
I think that's it. If something's working, milk it for all it's worth, and when it stops working, try something else. So,
Exactly.
again, you said, I think you hit the nail on the head there as well. One thing we haven't really spoken about is, squat, bench, deadlift, powerlifting, things like that. They don't feel so good. You feel beaten up, but when you're swinging a kettlebell around or doing the landmine and animal flow and body weight and rotational stuff, it feels good. It makes you feel good, not just doing it, but you feel good after. And the other word you said was when people are enjoying doing something.
Yeah. And it's,
We
and
can't forget that part of it.
I think it's background dependent too. I mean, I get a bunch of different types of people at my class. Some people who will come to a landmine class haven't touched weights, for a long time. Maybe they've been in the rope flow go-to world or whatever, and they just want to try this out. And, sometimes heavy lifting doesn't make you feel good, but sometimes you see someone come in and people are messing around and they haven't done it for a long time and they rip a heavy deadlift or they, do, and it does feel good because it's, like there's with the right balance and with the right, and obviously adequate form and coaching and like appropriate load. Yeah. And again, I keep doing the devil's advocate thing, but it's like, yeah, all this stuff can feel great, right? It's just about, like you said, balance, because I think ultimately people get dogmatic with some of this stuff, and for sure on the traditional lifting side. But yeah, that's that plateau thing too. I mean, I've chased big powerlifting numbers way in my past, and when the numbers are going up, it's addicting. And then when it's, tough and you're looking for that extra 5 pounds, sometimes that's where you end up feeling beat up and frustrated. So, I think it's a minimum effective dose thing, but also how effective is the dose? And if a little bit more than minimum makes a bigger impact, then maybe dump it on. So yeah.
That's it. And the aim with this podcast is just to tell people that, there are other ways. Because most people, when they think of the gym, they kind of mind already instantly goes to 70s era bodybuilding or powerlifting. So it's
Yeah. And I
spreading the
think
word
also,
of the alternative options.
yeah. And my dad showed me, pumping iron when I was a, 13-year-old, and I was inspired. And, the tough thing too is not throwing the baby out with the bathwater with all this stuff, because It's just like this constant pendulum of overcorrections. As a whole, humanity, we're just not, as healthy as we were either. And I think that there's certain things that become taboo or become sort of scoffed at by the leaders in an industry where it's like, okay, there was a big swing away from bodybuilding, and it's still super, a lot of people have that background. But ultimately, I think that there's a lot of Gen Pop people in particular who would get a lot out of just, microdosing some traditional bodybuilding methods. And, it's all relative. And I just say that because I am one that loves it all. I love West Side Barbell. I love Arnold Schwarzenegger. I love functional patterns. I love Goda. I love all of it. Um, yeah, I don't know. That becomes tough too, because especially for me and kind of in the space I'm in, it's like I want to stay true to what I'm putting out there and trying to help people with, but I definitely don't want to like scoff at anything that anybody's doing. Ultimately, most people that are working out are doing something healthy, and there's a lot of ways to skin that cat. And so I love a little bit of bodybuilding, and it's like I think some people in my space sort of look at a set of bicep curls as like, what are you do? You're gonna ruin everything, right? Like you are. It's like, no, not really. I'm just gonna send some blood to my biceps for the next couple hours, and it's gonna take me 3 minutes. And it's like, I don't know. Like I'm just not. I try to. And that's how I try to train the kids too. I work with these kids, and like when I started lifting weights, it was because I wanted to look like Hulk Hogan, and I did a bunch of curls and push-ups and my arms got bigger and I was addicted, and I'm still doing it to this day. And I don't want to like take that away from these kids either. I want them to feel the way that I felt when I fell in love with it too. And when I did it, it was so unstructured that it's like, man, I also want to give them this is a constant battle for me, but giving them some autonomy and the ability to just kind of explore and play around with the weight room as well. And it is interesting if I give them like, all right, you guys can do whatever exercise. You guys had a great session. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes. I want you to pick two exercises and just, do some, do it, free pump, free time. And they go right for the bicep curls. Right. And it's like, I just say to myself, shit, maybe I should throw in a few sets of bicep curls more often because they clearly want to do it. And like, I don't think that I'm sabotaging their athletic career by allowing them to do that. So yeah, I'm rambling again, but I love it all.
No, it's good. Like I think that bodybuilding net positive. If it gets people doing something, it's there. It might not be the most functional in terms of better human movement, but again, if it gets someone doing something and it makes them feel good, brilliant.
And I think there's like that hierarchy of goals with most people who work with someone or coach people. It's like even me with these, these are competitive athletes. If you tell them to write down their top 5 goals, and it's like, okay, I want to move better. I want to be more mobile. Somewhere on their body composition is going to pop up,
Yeah, I want to.
right?
It's a
I
paint
want,
job on the car, isn't it? You want to
yeah,
look better still.
yeah, I wanna look better or I wanna put on some muscle, and you can put on muscle with all functional patterns, movement, maybe, but it's not the fastest way to put on muscle. So, if we're putting together a good holistic program, there's probably an opportunity for 10 minutes to, like, just address that goal, and it might not look like something that you wanna throw on Instagram if you're, like, Mr. Functional Coach, but it's not wasted time,
There's a place
necessarily.
for everything. Yeah, take what's useful, discard what's not, put in what's uniquely your own. Yeah. One more thing then before we go, like, is there one kind of key takeaway you'd like to give
Yeah,
people?
I think for me, the key takeaway would be that, like, there are different postures that, our body falls into and uses, for different things, and they can be loaded. So if you watch somebody pick up, an awkward object, oftentimes they'll coil their core to reach one arm to pick up maybe like a bedside table, or you go to carry a ladder. I think that it's worth exploring postures outside of neutral spine, that they need to be loaded appropriately, but you can really make a ton of progress with the right movements. And just explore those postures, and don't be afraid to lift weights while you do it. because
Yeah.
it's
I
it's
think we're getting somewhere in the industry with the kind of rotation and the coiling core and spinal engine, and we're not even really touched on that
yeah, well,
specifically,
that's
but
great. Yeah, no, I
I
think
think,
we have. And even if you see, you watch strongman guys, a lot of that stuff is done outside of neutral. So there's like just a lot of, sandbag. There's a lot of stuff that is becoming more popular and ultimately unconventional oftentimes means outside of neutral. So pay attention to what's going on with your trunk and explore it all.
yeah, I say that all the time with the strong. I think other than kind of the squats and deadlifts, strongman training, like not to the excess that, the top level do it, probably some of the most natural and functional movements you can do. Just lift and carry.
You got
It's
carries, you got
fantastic.
odd object lifting, and yeah,
Yeah.
it's great.
Perfect. Okay. One more time then. Where can people find you?
On Instagram, it's Landmine University. You can tap into links there. You can go landmineuniversity.com to see when our upcoming classes are, or to tap into the virtual certification there as well. And yeah, feel free always to hit me up on Instagram if you need help finding the best next step.
Awesome. Thank you.
For sure.
Thanks for listening to this episode. I appreciate you being here. If you've got value from this, please hit follow or subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. You'll find any links in the show notes. And if you're ready to move better, feel better, and build a body that actually lasts, you can join my free 7-day Move Better challenge at www.movebetter.club. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.